Now, in the CSS module, you might have realized that one of the biggest annoyances of using CSS is actually layout. We've looked at all the ways that you can lay out items, from changing the position to the display to floating, and you would have noticed that it can get very complex very, very quickly. And often, all that you need to do is just lay out things very simply, according to very simple rules. So let's take a look at the Airbnb website. And I've pulled up the listings for where to stay in Bali. This has kind of become like my spiritual home. So if you take a look, they have this very, very simple format of 4 listings per row, right? And if we go onto a smaller screen size, say on an iPad or an iPhone, it doesn't make sense to have 4 items in a row because they'll get crushed and they become really, really tiny so that you can't actually see the image or read the text properly. So what happens is that if you do go onto this website and you start going from the desktop size to make the jump to the iPad size, you would have noticed that there is a little step just about here where 4 items in a row turns into 3 items in a row. And this makes each of the listings more visible and more easy to read on the iPad size. Now, there's one other jump when you get to about the smartphone size, which is around here. And this size only has 2 listings per row. Again, using more of that width and allowing you to be able to view the images more easily. Now, this is very, very easily done using Bootstrap. And this is one of the biggest reasons why people like using Bootstrap. It's because it makes creating responsive websites very, very easy. Now, a lot of people think that responsive means it's fast or it loads up quickly, but it actually doesn't. It means that the website responds to the size of the screen or the viewport. So that means that it looks slightly different when it's on iPad or when it's on desktop or versus when it's on mobile. So let's take a look at how we can implement this super easily using Bootstrap so that we can use it for our website's layout. And more specifically, I want this title, this big title where it says meet new and interesting dogs nearby, plus the 2 download buttons to show up on the left side of the screen, taking up roughly half of the screen. And then I want this mobile phone image to take up the right 50% of the screen. And then when it goes down to maybe say iPhone sized, for everything to be stacked up one on top of each other, taking up 100% of the width. Now let's load up the documentation for this. So if you go into documentation and then layout, and then we're going to go into grid to look at the grid system. And you can see that we can create these columns as easily as by using some divs and specifying a few Bootstrap classes. So let's see that in action by launching a new code play. And I want you to follow along with me just so that you can mess around with the code and really fully understand what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change our framework to Bootstrap 4. And at some point in the future, once a lot of people begin using Bootstrap 4, it will become the default selection. So you might not have to do this step. But for now, there's still a lot of people who haven't learnt this new framework and the rules for it. So you might see that the default might be Bootstrap 3. But we are going to sit at the bleeding edge of technology. So that is why we'll always be using the latest version of Bootstrap in our course. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new div and we're going to give it a class of row. Now inside this div, I'm going to create another div, and this one will have a class of column. Now I'm also going to add some inline styles just so that we can see it more clearly when it gets rendered on screen and we can differentiate it from other columns or other rows. So I'm just going to set the background color to red, and then we'll give it a border of 1 pixel solid. So now let's close off that div. And of course, remember that divs don't appear unless they have some content. So we're just going to give it the name of this class, which is the column that we used. So now if we hit run, you will see that I have this full width column that is taking up the entire width of the screen. So I have basically a single row. Now, the interesting thing about this class column is that it will divide up the row to as many sections as it needs in order to equally distribute all of the columns. So that means that if I have two divs that are both class equals column, then they will both only take up 50% of the screen. And equally, if I add a third one, then each of these column divs will take up a third of that row's width. Now, what if I wanted a column that only took up half of the width of the screen? So you might think that, okay, the way to do this is to delete that third div so that we have two column divs resting side by side in the same row. Well, you might think that, okay, you could probably use some CSS and, make this div appear white or not there. Well, there's actually a much, much easier way using Bootstrap. So let's create a new row just so that we can keep a reference to this and we can see it on screen. So again, we're going to create a new div with the class row. And inside here, I'm going to create a div that has a class called column-6. And again, I'm going to basically add the same style. So background color, and this one I'm going to make green. And then again, border 1 pixel solid. And I'm going to close off that div. And inside here, I'm going to call this column-6 so that we can see it when we run it. Now, you'll notice that in this case, my column only takes up 50% of the width of the screen without the need for anything else on the right. And the cool thing about this is that you can use a number to specify how much of the row do you want to take up. And the total for a single row is 12. So that means that if you add a div that has a number, say column-3, then it will only take up a quarter of the screen. So remember, 12 divided by 3 equals 4, right? So column 3 only takes up 3 units inside 12 units, so therefore it's only a quarter of the screen. And you can repeat this code so that you actually fill up the row. So for example, you could have a column-2, so that's a sixth of the row. And then you could have something like a column-1, right? Go all the way down to the smallest unit, which means this is a 12th of the row. And now with the 6 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, we get 12. And so now we fill up the entire width of the row. Now, that's all very well and good, but the only problem with this is that as you change the size of the viewport, say if we go down to a tablet size or a mobile size, none of these columns change in width. So what if we want something similar to what Airbnb has, where we can say that maybe on the desktop size, we would want 4 columns, right? Taking up equal width. But maybe on iPad, we only want 3 columns. And on iPhone, we only want 2 columns. So how can we do that? So let's go ahead and add another row where we add a responsive column. So I'm going to create a div that is going to have a class of row. So all of these columns use the div class row. And then I'm going to add a div that has a different class. And this class is going to be column-md for medium-6. And then I'm just going to paste in our style over here. And I'm going to change the color to blue just so that we can see the difference. And we're going to close off that div and I'm going to call this column-md-6. And now if we run our code, you can see that similar to the column-6, this column medium-6 also takes up 6 units, so half of the screen. But say if I add another div, you can see that we've got 2 columns inside our row currently, the blue ones. But if I switch to a smartphone size, you can see that they each now take up 100% of the width of the screen. But on tablet, they still take up half of the width. So what this column medium 6 means is that we should have a 6-unit column on any size from medium size or tablet size upwards. So that means tablet, laptop, large desktop, they all will take up 6 units. But anything smaller than the medium size, namely on mobile, they will take up the full width. So let's delete these two divs in the non-responsive sort of section, and let's change this to a column 6. So we now basically have two 6-column divs. Now let's change this blue actually to a yellow, because I think it'll make the text a little bit more visible so that you can see it slightly easier. Now you can see that we've got essentially the same thing in 3 rows, right? These two are 2 columns that are taking up 50% of the width each, because the entire row has to take up 100%. Now the second one, each column is only taking up 6 units, but it's non-responsive. And the third one, each column is only taking up 6 units as long as it's tablet sized or larger. So let's switch to the laptop size. You can see there's no difference. But now let's switch to the smartphone size. And you can see that the third type of columns actually are responsive. So you can use this code and play around with it to see the difference by specifying that medium keyword and not doing so. Now, what if you wanted to be more specific than that? What if you wanted to recreate the Airbnb experience? So you have 4 items per row, or 4 columns rather, on desktop, but then on tablet to only have 3, and then on mobile to only have 2. How would you do that using Bootstrap? Well, let's modify our third row so that we have something that works in a similar way. So the first thing is that we need 4 divs to play around with. So I'm going to add another 2 divs to the bottom. And now we have 4 divs that are in this responsive kind of mode. Let's start from the simplest, which is I want there to be 4 columns on desktop. So 12 divided by 4 is 3. So we need a 3-unit column. And we can specify this by changing the keyword to large. So now we have column large 3. And if you run that, you can see that we've got a 3-unit column on desktop. So let's go ahead and change all of the other divs to this kind of format. So if we run now, you'll see that we have 4 columns, each taking up 3 units on desktop. But anything smaller than desktop, they will take up 100% of the width. So on tablet and on mobile, they will take up 100%. So that's not quite what we want, because on tablet, we want it to take up a third of the row. So 12 divided by 3 is 4. So let's add another rule in here where we say on the medium-sized screens and above, we want to have a 4-unit column. So now let's again replace all of these other divs with this new format. And if we run our code, you'll see that on the tablet sized, each of these columns now take up 4 units when we're on the tablet or the medium sized. And on desktop, it goes to that column large 3 rule and becomes a 3-unit column. And similarly on the large desktop, it's also the same. Now, what about mobile? Well, it's still taking up 100% of the width, unless we specify another class. So on the smaller size screen, we want each column to take up only 50% of the width, so that we end up with 2 columns per row. So 2 columns per row means 12 divided by 2, so that's a 6-unit column. So let's add this to our text, and let's delete these 3 other divs so that we can make a copy of this first one. and paste it in. So we now have 4 divs, which take up a quarter of the width when we're on the desktop size or larger, but only a third of the width when we're on tablet, and only half of the width when we're on mobile. So you can see that when we're on tablet, because we can't fit all 4 of these on the same row, it actually pushes it to the next row automatically. Now, there's a lot of new ideas in this lesson, and in order to really fully understand this concept, you will need to have a play around with the code yourself. So as a challenge, I want you to create another set of responsive columns, but this one's going to have slightly different rules from the previous row. So if you've already followed along with the code, you should have your own version of this code play. Now, if you haven't, I'm going to include a link in the resources for this section so that you can open up the code play and you can copy the code in my HTML section and paste it to your own code play. Now, what I want you to do is to create another row below these 3, and you can give it a different color. Now, it doesn't matter what you choose as long as you can see the difference from the previous rows. Now, for this particular set of columns, I want you to make it responsive. So on the larger sizes, so desktop and also on laptop, you should have 6 columns per row. Now, on tablet, you should only have 4 columns per row. And on mobile, they should each take up 100% of the width. So pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so how did that go? Well, in order to complete the challenge, you really need to understand how the grid system works. And if you get stuck, you always remember that there's always the documentation to go back to. Now, once you've read that and it all makes sense, then we can get started. So we're going to create another div, of course, and this will be the row, which is going to contain our columns. And inside this row, we're going to create a new column. Now, here we have to think carefully. What we want is that on the larger sizes, so on the laptop and desktop, we want there to be a 2-unit column because it's going to take up 1/6 of the width. So that's going to be column large -2. Now, the other thing we want to happen is that on the medium sizes or on the tablet size and above, we want to have a 3-unit column. So that's column -medium -3 because 12 divided by 3 is 4. So that's 4 columns per row, which is what we wanted. Now, for the smaller size, you can either say column small -12 for the column to take up the full 100% of the width, or you can actually leave that out because by default, all the columns should take up 100% of the width. So now that we've got our classes, let's add in our style so that we can see it and make it more visible. So in this case, I'm going to change my background color to gray. Now, it doesn't really matter what you choose. And then I'm going to add the text here into my div so that my div actually shows up because it has some content rather than just style. So now let's hit run. And we've now got this column that takes up 1/6 of the width. Now, in order to make that a little bit more visible, I'm going to copy this and paste in another 5 copies. And we can count that there's now 6 columns in our row on the laptop and on the desktop sizes. Now, the next step to check is what happens on tablet. And you can see that our rule of column medium -3 means that we have 3-unit columns. So 12 divided by 3 is 4 columns per row on the tablet size. And on the mobile size, we have 100% of the width because we've only specified that anything above medium should be 3 units and anything below automatically becomes 100%. So if you didn't manage to get it, create it now and see if it makes sense. And also just mess around with the layout, try to make a row that has maybe 12 items on large sizes, or maybe only 6 items on the smaller mobile screen. But basically, the key to understanding this is trying to get the code to do what you want it to. And that way you'll understand how all of these classes work. And if you get confused, there's always the grid system documentation to fall back on.